Welcome once again to the chat room. Thanks for joining us. Nice to have your company. This is the program I like to think of as the fastest 28 minutes on television, where we grab a really big topic and chew our way through it furiously. The one doing all the chewing is the Dean of Sydney, Phillip, Jensen.
I don't like that. It sounds like chewing gum.
We'll chew our way through a difficult topic instead.
Okay.
To do with rights, human rights. I mean, I remember going through years ago the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, and as a journalist I've had people lobby me and say we should have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights as part of our Australian Constitution or part of the way our government works. And there's a case for this being put up now, isn't there?
Oh yes, it's a live debate now, although I think the shift is away from the Bill of Rights and the Constitution because you've got to get it through a referendum. And Australia's notoriously for voting no on referenda.
The Australians tend to think, oh, I don't know about this, make it no, be safe.
Yes, and I think with a referenda you've actually got to do all the states, majority in all the states as well as a majority.
You've got to get a majority of the overall vote and a majority of the states to get it through.
Pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
And so I think a charter gives you, it's got less status. It's not built into the Constitution. It's something that the government of the day agrees to, and hopefully that will have implications for future agreements and for courts in making their decisions about rights, but it is something that can also be changed by government.
So the government could just in theory sit down and say, right, this is the Charter of Rights, these are the rights you've got, that's it?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll get to whether they should do that or not in a moment, but let's begin by saying what are rights? What are?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it?
Yes.
They're the opposite of wrongs. Yes. Well, I think they do come out of a negative. That is, they're the opposite of duties. They're the flip sides of duties. So when I say you shall not kill, then that is the duty laid upon you. That is the duty to acknowledge the other person has the right to live.
Right, okay.
And so you shall not steal gives the right for someone somewhere to own property. Because in a society where all property is communal, it's impossible to steal.
Yes, no one has a right to own any property.
No one has any right to own a property.
But you can't steal.
You can't steal.
Yes, okay.
So once you say you cannot steal, you're implying it was right for someone or the organisation or something to own property.
So I've sometimes wondered whether the United Nations would ever come out with the UN Declaration of Universal Human Responsibilities.
Unlikely.
Yeah, it does seem a little unlikely, doesn't it?
Yes.
So, is it odd to have rights without responsibilities?
The rights are really for the powerful. That is, the rights are for the vulnerable and the weak, but the declaration of what the vulnerable and weak's rights are is the restriction in the powerful. Right. So you declare you have a right to own private property to stop the powerful people taking it from you.
Particularly the government and things like that.
Yes. Yeah, so you have the right to life, stops the government. You have the right to education. It tells those who are in power and authority how to treat you.
In fact, the people who argue for a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights say the point is to limit what governments can do.
Yes.
So there are certain areas they can't stray into.
It's anti-government. That's why in the foundation of America, a Bill of Rights occurs.
Right.
Because they were sick of European governments controlling everything and all that they did, and so they established these inalienable, unquestionable rights.
And they said, and the government will do this much.
And no more.
Yes.
And the "and no more" is the important part.
We'll come back to the American experience in a minute, but are rights biblical? Is it a biblical idea that we can have rights?
Well, inasmuch as the Bible teaches us duties and responsibilities, it is.
Right, yes.
But the Bible doesn't approach us much from the basis of what are our rights. It does teach us lots about it. So it says who we are. We are created in the image of God. And that carries in it certain rights. So that's said in chapter 1 of Genesis. In chapter 9 of Genesis, we're told no one is to take the life of a human because humans are in the image of God.
Right, so being in the image of God gives us the right to life.
Gives us
not unlimited, but a right to life.
That's right, but it is not unlimited.
Right.
That's very important because the government is called upon to execute judgment and execute literally judgment against wickedness and lawlessness and unlawful criminal behaviour. And so our right to life is not an absolute right. But it is one that the government and everybody, including the animal world, should respect.
There is a problem with bills of rights, charters of rights human beings draw up, because they're human beings.
Yes and no. I like yeses and noes. Because God has given to governments responsibility to rule this world, as He has given humanity responsibility to rule this world. And so we have built into our very nature the concepts of rights and wrongs, and of duties and responsibilities, and therefore benefits. So before the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," was ever declared by God, Joseph knew it was wrong to commit adultery with his master's wife, Potiphar's wife. And there are rights and wrongs that are built into the very fabric of God's created world and into the fabric of our minds and cultures.
So when Paul talks about even the Gentiles know what is right and wrong, that's what he means.
That's right. And he can say that even the Gentiles wouldn't have a man living with his father's wife. Is that, I think it's father's wife, isn't it? It's 1 Corinthians 5, I know where it is. So even they have got better morals than that.
Yes, yeah.
So morals are not limited to the revelation of God's word. Indeed, the Pharisees are accused by Jesus of straining out, I always get this the right way around, straining out the gnat and swallowing the camel.
Yes.
Got to get the right way around. It's like when you say the lame man saw and the blind man leapt. You know?
Easy to do. Yes.
Anyway, Jesus accused the Pharisees because he says, you should see justice and truth and not confuse that with tithing your mint and your cumin. And
Right.
Now, where should they see that there are big issues like justice and truth and that there are other issues which are small? Well, it's inherent, it's logical, it's obvious.
But people still have problems with it. I mean, the founding fathers of the American Constitution had this great line about, you know, all men are created equal.
Yes.
And they own slaves.
They own slaves, and some don't believe in creation.
So how can they believe all people are created evil?
Well,
equal?
I mean, it came out of a Christian culture.
Yes.
And at least Christianised, I mean, some of the deists, but at least Christianised enough to believe in creation.
Yes.
So it's not all men are accidents of equal value.
Yes.
And of course, it's now Professor Singing is saying, well, all humans are of equal value with any other sentient being.
Well, it's difficult to see, if we're not made in the image of God, how human beings can be said to have any rights or any responsibilities. They're just,
Yes.
you know.
Well, if I'm just an accident of the Big Bang, then why should I care about seals or whales or butterflies or anything else?
Yeah, well, whales don't care about me, so why should I bother?
No.
Yes.
I don't think they care about
Well, they never campaign on my behalf.
No, they don't. Although sharks are very attractive, I understand. But yes, you don't ask them. You don't expect them to have responsibility.
So to some extent, the idea of a Charter of Rights or a Bill of Rights is a bit of a, it's the last little ripple that's washing out from a Christianised culture to some extent.
To some extent it is. It's coming out of there. It's making sure that weak, vulnerable people are cared for and that humans are declared to have certain rights. And all humans, not just the free men, all humans have these rights, etc. So there's that washing out of Christianity. But it's also the non-Christian world trying to invent a moral system, a value system that all will adhere to, which we can impose upon the community. And at that point, it's actually very secularist. It's very, we don't believe in God and his ways. We now have our own rights that we are establishing.
And the danger of us establishing our own rights is that human nature can be inconsistent and corrupt and all kinds of things. I mean, coming back to Thomas Jefferson,
Yes.
who they would revere as a great humanist, drafting the Declaration of Human Rights and owning slaves and getting one of them pregnant several times.
Yes.
So
denying the children.
Yes. So there is a problem having people who think like that tell us what our rights are and what the limitations are.
Yes, but it's not only the poor performance of humans compared to our high standards, which is true of Christians at times too, but it's also what is right. How have they determined what our duties and our rights are? So at that point in time, one of the rights that was very important was the right to bear arms.
Yep.
Subsequently, many of the people who are very big on Bill of Rights today They don't want the community to bear arms. They want to take weaponry out of the community. Now, inside America, there are still many people who believe in the right to bear arms.
Quite passionately.
Passionately believe in the right to bear arms. But it was done in part to say the government is not the only group who have the right to bear arms.
And the government cannot impose force of arms upon its citizens or something like that.
And if you had seen the persecution of Europe in the 15th, 16th centuries, etc., well, you could understand why the citizens would say, well, we have the right to bear arms as much as anybody else.
But it does freeze a moment in time into a document.
Into it, yes, which is almost unchangeable.
So if you write it now, you're freezing in time whatever the culture happens to be focused on at the moment.
Right.
So when I think of the people I know, there is no sense of moral outrage about abortion at all in Australia. There is in America, but not here. But an enormous sense of moral outrage about Japanese killing whales.
Yes.
Now,
That's right.
so you'd end up whatever people are concerned about at this minute being distilled into the Charter.
Yes, which is unlikely, if it's any good, will not be changed easily and quickly.
Right.
I mean, that's why they want it as a Bill of Rights, so that it can never be changed, because that is totally cementing in today upon our grandchildren. But even a charter, if you can change it, if the government can change it, well, it doesn't protect us.
Yes.
It's not about our rights, it's just about the current limitations of government action, which we already have in law.
And if the world changes dramatically and the government feels it needs to resume huge amounts of land, then suddenly we need to redraft the Charter.
Yes.
You're that right you had to private property, I'm sorry, no longer exists.
No,
so what's the point in that case?
Well, the point is they're wanting to say they want to limit government, and it's government wanting to limit government. They want to limit abuse of government, which they see, and they want to protect every person having a right within society rather than certain groups having unfair control within society. They're good things, they're desirable things, but it's a pretty blunt instrument to do it in. See, it creates real problems for the judges and the law courts, because now, once you have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights, any piece of legislation, any piece of action can be dragged up to be judged against this Bill of Rights. And the judges have to determine whether it is or not. Now, most of the kinds of Charter of Rights, Bill of Rights, by their very nature have to be very generalised things. You have the right to, every child has a right to education. It doesn't spell out what education,
or to what level, or what age,
level or anything. It's just a right to education.
Yes.
You then have a child being brought before you who maybe have some mental difficulties, and they say, well, it hasn't had an education. What is the government going to do in this case, in that case? And so case after case is brought up. So it increases the amount of work that judges do. But then corrupts the whole process, because the judges are now the ones who can reinterpret the rights, can redefine the rights to fit the different situations. And they become masters in being able to, deconstruct the document in such a way that fits another generation and another sets of circumstances that were never imagined by the people who drafted it.
And they then are accused of being unelected legislators.
Well,
unelected, not answerable to the
right.
electorate, but they are deciding what this covers and what this doesn't cover.
That then means that we politicise the High Court and the Supreme Courts. Now, that's very much the case in America. Every time you want to try and put up a High Court judge, it's a massive political fight that takes place, especially as the High Court judge is going to outlast the legislature, outlast the president. Yeah,
there are 9 of them, and you want the balance to be your way, not the opposition's way, that kind of thing.
And so in your 8 years in which you're president, you keep sowing in your kinds of people on the High Court who therefore might actually continue for 10, 15 years after you.
And hoping the people who don't agree with you retire or die or something, so you can replace them.
And so it highly politicises the judicial system, which is a very bad way to get good judges. Because judges should be dispassionate and indifferent is the technical word. Yes. Not just impartial, indifferent, unconnected, without any concern for the situation, just concern for justice, for truth. But now, well, it's not like that. So it corrupts the courts, it blocks up the courts, and it turns the courts into legislators rather than the government, the parliament, being the legislative body.
And taking responsibility
And
for
taking
it.
responsibility.
There is another problem, which seems to me to be a big problem. If you've got a lot of people promoting this, who are saying this is what needs to be in the Charter of Rights, what's their foundation? What is the foundation
Yes.
for saying this is a right, that's not a right? On
Yes.
what basis does that come?
Yes, and are there first order rights and second order rights and
Yes.
third order rights?
And so if these two rights are in conflict, how are they resolved?
How do you resolve the conflict? So
Yes.
there's a conflict between rights for homosexual people, for example, and rights for religious or cultural groups who do not believe in homosexuality. Now, how do you balance those two? Because by giving the homosexual community every right or every privilege that they want, including running this organisation that's against them,
Yes,
you've destroyed this one.
yes.
But if you then uphold this organisation that won't have homosexuals, you're saying, well, no, the homosexuals don't have all the rights of the community.
Yes.
Now, with or without a Bill of Rights, that's a very difficult issue for government to work through. But we want as flexible a system to cope with the complexities of life, rather than a rigid set of rules, which we then have to reinvent and deconstruct to make fit. Now, at the moment, what we've got are things like common law. We've got parliaments that you can vote in, you can vote out. They can make temporary legislation that deals with this issue or that issue. And you've got a culture in which the whole thing is being worked out and discussed. But a Bill of Rights, that's a very heavy sledgehammer for one group to hit over the head of the other.
So in some ways it might be better for these things to be things that political parties argue for at elections.
Yes.
And are either supported on or not supported
Yes.
on, because that way the whole community has a say.
That's right. And we're all engaged in it.
Right.
And the legislation they bring into effect, then the courts can apply as the situation arises. But that then at least brings our justice in touch with the community opinion. Now, I would hope that our community still has enough of a common culture that they have a belief in right and wrong on a wider front than just current fashion in thought.
A belief in protecting the weakest members of society,
Yes.
that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yep.
which not every philosophical system believes in,
Yes.
nor every modern philosopher believes in. Mr. Singer doesn't believe in it. There are the children who are born with sufficient deformities, he would say, should be removed from society. The old people who have moved into dementia.
Well, some euthanasia advocates would say exactly that.
Yes.
So the weakest members of society would not be protected in
No,
that sense.
they wouldn't be protected by some very current, popular, ethical things. Now, do we want a Bill of Rights to protect those? Well, that'd be nice, but no, it's better that we have community standards that are taught and understood and agreed upon, and courts and legislature that are as answerable to us.
It's interesting when you think about that. The one thing a Charter of Rights will do is freeze this moment in time.
Yes.
If the Charter, the people arguing for it now, actually had a Charter that had been drawn up 50 years ago and reflected the values of 1950, would they be happy with it?
They would not be happy with it at all. They'd be very, very unhappy with it. That's
Because
a good illustration.
it would probably declare that abortion was an offence against the rights of the unborn, wouldn't
Yes. Well, I think in many states of Australia abortion is still illegal.
it? Right.
It's just the law is not prosecuted.
So how do we approach this? Do we approach this by saying it is better if this thing is not condensed to black and white because it's simply going to be unhelpful?
I think so, personally, but I think we do need to do the homework of trying to work out, well, what are the rights that the Bible, what are the place of rights in the Bible?
Right.
Now, I think it's a different philosophical system, so it's a dangerous kind of question to impose rights and to look at rights in the Bible, because the Bible is much more concerned about our responsibility than about our rights. But responsibilities always imply rights.
So if we look at the responsibilities the Bible imposes upon us, we can say, what rights does that impose?
Yes. Yes, what rights does that imply?
Yes. So if I'm given the responsibility of loving my neighbour as myself, then my neighbour is given the right, when in desperate circumstances, to be helped and supported by me.
That's right. And now how far you want to push down those things, you see, because if you put that into a Bill of Rights,
Yes.
you've actually then constituted the country as socialist.
Yes.
In a sense. Now, but to actually explore what the Bible is saying, I think it's an important thing for us to do. And then also to be looking at what the Bible is saying about justice, about righteousness, about right and wrong. And so I think the Bill of Rights gives Christians opportunities to really rethink our morality, to really rethink what is important or unimportant in our social concerns.
Not a bad thing to talk about in our Bible study groups. for
Very
example.
worthwhile to do, to try and work out, well, what are the core values of social life, government, social, public life, that the Bible would teach us and that we should be upholding and maintaining. That's a valuable exercise, and it's the rights argument that forces us to do it. But rights, it's not a very biblical way of running a country. And
It's got problems.
It's got real problems in the practicalities of implementation.
If we're going to talk about it in our Bible study groups, do we need to do the other thing of saying, if I'm going to be realistic about this and work out what responsibilities I have and what rights are there, I have to work out what I'm doing moment by moment, as it were, day by day in my relationships with other people.
Yes. Yeah.
So when I actually confront situations where I'm busy and there's a drunk who's collapsed on the street and he's not my responsibility, that's when we work out at the coalface, as it were, what our rights and responsibilities are, isn't it?
That's right. And it's the frameworks of bills of rights can be just too high order to deal with the realities of our lives. The Bible deals with the reality of our lives. And so what right does the man who has fallen down drunk in the gutter, what right does he have in terms of me and my responsibilities for him?
Yes.
And it's the Good Samaritan raises this kind of question for me. And to fall back, well, it's not my responsibility, which a Bill of Rights might make clear, it's not my responsibility. That's not the reality of life.
Yeah, and there can be a problem in the existence of a Charter of Rights can make us think, well, he is the government's responsibility.
Oh yes, that's even worse, isn't it? That's awful.
I was walking down the street with a friend once and we encountered this situation. I was going to keep going. That was my reaction to my responsibility. But Ron went over and said, "Are you okay, mate?" And the bloke staggered to his feet and said, "You got a few dollars." But my friend then took him to a cafe and bought him a coffee. He said, "I'm not going to give him any money. He'll just drink it. But I'll buy him the coffee."
That's right.
Now, I mean, he was busy, he had things to do. Exercising our responsibilities, giving people their rights, is costly.
It's costly. And of course the Christian responsibilities and rights, massively bigger than the government's and what they would lay on us. But the worry is that the politically correct people in government and power at the time will try and extend their wider view of rights and wrongs as well. And so we Christians are facing a fairly strong political problem at the moment.
So could it be that we end up with a charter, I mean it's a possibility, we end up with a charter which says to churches, there are things you used to do, you can't do any longer?
Yes, well that's more and more the case.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm always amused by the separation of church and state, because it's supposed to defend both the church and the state. But every time the church does anything, there's hue and cry about, oh no, what about separation of church and state? But every time the state actually imposes anything on the church, well, that's what should be. That's right. That's a matter of rights.
Yeah, so the state can actually stop the church putting up the nativity scene in the front yard, but the church can't do anything.
That's right. Yes. Now, so far, we have exemptions on anti-discrimination legislation. But once you start discussing the Bill of Rights, people want to say, no, if it's a right, then there's no exemption. No exemption for religion. And so one right has been denied, that is the right of free association for people who want to believe whatever they want to believe, in order to provide another right, that is that everybody gets treated the same in all circumstances.
The problem for us as Christians is it's not an easy area, is it? It's an area which is quite complex.
Yes.
And we need to do some wrestling with Scripture and with how we live our lives as Christians if we're going to see it clearly.
Well, and if we're going to influence our nation here in the next year or two.
Right.
Because in the next year or two,
It will come up, will it?
This will come up. This is
Right.
on the agenda. People are already working on it. And if we haven't thought through what the Bible is teaching us and how we put that into operation in society, we're going to get caught out completely.
So a mob of public servants presumably will sit in a back room and draft a text, and that will come up and we'll be asked what we think of it. We need to have done our thinking before it turns up.
A mob of public servants will sit in the back room and draft it under the pressure of particularist lobby groups.
Right.
Who really want to change the culture of society away from Christianity.
So it's social engineering on their part.
Yeah.
So
this is not a neutral thing. This is an anti-Christian backed thing, which you can present neutrally. If you're one of the public servants drafting it, you say, no, I'm just a public servant drafting it. And that is completely true. But who is whispering in the ears of the public servants who are drafting it? Who's lobbying it? Who wants it? Who needs it? Who is at the moment being denied rights in Australia?
Who would get rights from this
Who will get rights from this thing? If they are such a person, well, let's take it to Parliament, let's change the law, let's complain to the courts, because you can change any of those things at the moment.
So there may be a case for Christians, having discussed and debated this amongst themselves, writing a letter to their local federal members saying, we don't really need this.
Yes.
Yeah.
That can be the case. And when you've got the right, for example, that all men and women will be treated the same in all circumstances, that means your daughter can be conscripted to the army.
Mm.
That's not what people were thinking when they thought, oh yes, I want the rights for men and women to be treated equally. Because I don't mind my daughters going and getting a job, rising to the top of the corporation, making a lot of money, keeping their old dad in a new form of life. I don't mind that. But no, I will not allow my daughter to be conscripted into the army. So that puts me in real collision course with my government if they ever try and do it.
This is something that's complex, so we need to talk to each other about it, don't we?
Absolutely. It is complex, and we've got to do our thinking and our homework before it all becomes a public debate that we're engaged in.
Complex issue, but that's all the more reason to wrestle with it. Phillip Jensen, thank you for that.
That's all right, it's a pleasure.
And we'll see you again next time on The Chat Room.